It is budget season here in Massachusetts. Technically, it's been budget season in Massachusetts, but July is creeping ever closer, and that, in theory, means the House and Senate are hustling away on Beacon Hill, finalizing a budget to send to Governor Healey. In reality, it's a long and complicated process where small differences between budget bills can wind on for an extra month or more, with plenty of critical infrastructure hanging in the balance. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, CommonWealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. And while the chambers are toiling away in conference committee, it's worth, I think, taking a look at where we stand now, how we got here, and what we can expect over the course of the summer as federal uncertainty impacts state policy. And there's nobody better to help me piece through it than my guest today, Doug Howgate, president of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, or MTF. So, Doug, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
So it is budget season, the holiest time of the year here in Massachusetts, and also a very long adventure for everybody who tries to follow it. So, Doug, why don't you start by giving us kind of the map of where we are right now? It is June 12th when we're recording. What do we have in front of us?
Well, it's hard for me to believe that your listeners aren't just totally dialed into the state budget process, but for the few who aren't. So we are right now in conference committee for the fiscal year 2026 budget. So the state fiscal year runs July 1st to June 30th. So we're about 2 weeks away from the start of fiscal year 2026. And what we currently have is we have a budget bill that was engrossed by the House. We have a version that was engrossed by the Senate, and we now have 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate in conference committee negotiating out a compromise budget that'll then go to both the House and the Senate for just an up or down vote. So the work of this conference committee is really critical for putting in place the spending plan that's going to govern a lot of what the state does over the next 12 months.
Can you talk about what this period of time usually looks like for people like you who are trying to figure out what is going to come out of that room?
Sure. And I can speak both from the Mass Taxpayers Foundation perspective, but also having worked in Ways and Means Committee for a while. So there's kind of 2 things to keep in mind in any conference committee. So one, when you're talking about the budget, you're talking about 300-page documents. And at the end of the day, every single difference between those 2 documents, of which there are literally thousands, have to be negotiated and resolved. And I'm sure we're going to talk about some of the larger policy differences or spending differences, but you have to resolve every Oxford comma, every semicolon, every slight difference in dates. And so a lot of the work that goes on, especially at the staff level, is one, documenting every single difference, making sure everyone agrees on every single difference, and then kind of bucketing them into what are the things that we can just resolve at a pretty mundane level? What are some big policy differences? What are the spending differences? And so a lot of the work, especially early on, is kind of making sure both the House and the Senate are operating from the same agreed script of this is what we did on spending, this is what you did on spending. And then once that happens, then you try to really get into the, okay, so how are we actually going to resolve this thing? And hopefully those things happen in parallel, right? You're not totally waiting on one because time is tight, but that's really kind of the process. And I will say that obviously one of the common critiques of conference committee is it's not transparent. People can't see it. I will say, and again, I'm biased because I worked in this process. It's hard for me to envision how you end up with kind of good, honest, compromise conversations on some of these tough issues that doesn't allow folks to not have everything they say be in the public record and things like that. So I do think there is a benefit to these conversations taking place. The final version is absolutely public, gets produced before the House and Senate. So I think there is a reason why you hopefully give folks a little bit of time to figure out what the differences are and how to resolve them.
And I think another helpful thing for our listeners, and I'm glad you also kind of talked about your background at Ways and Means, is what's your sort of current positioning? So Mass Taxpayers is, we usually shorthand it as business backed. So what is the kind of viewpoint that you're taking as you're coming into watching these budget debates, just so that everybody can understand as we get into the policies?
So MTF we're really a think tank here in Massachusetts, and we are we're largely membership supported by large employer members, but we're also supported by philanthropy, by individuals, things like that. And our mission is about looking at the long-term, equitable and sustainable economic health of the Commonwealth. And from a public finance lens, what that really means is 2 things. One is trying to inform folks about what's going on. The budget is an opaque process. It is a complicated document, but it's a really important document. And so one of the most important things we do is try to just put out timely analysis of wherever you are on the ideological spectrum, this is what's happening. And so I would, if folks are curious about that, definitely check out our website, look at that work. And then the other thing we try to do is advance our policy goals that relate to that sustainable economic outlook, right? So that means balanced budgets, right? It means budgets that are thinking about challenges that are likely to come down the pike, how we make sure we have a resilient budget, structurally sound budgets, and also budgets that make important investments in things like transportation or early education or some of those areas that are so critical to the state's economic growth.
All right, let's start to get into this from the top level on down. What's the math look like right now? What is the top line number that we've seen from the governor, from the House, the Senate? How are we resolving the amendments that they've been kind of putting forward and the way those have kind of fiddled with the top line so far?
Sure. So I think the big picture is, so we've got about a $61 billion budget proposal being negotiated. And both on the spending and revenue front, the House and Senate took very similar tacks. So there are certainly differences. We'll talk through some of those, but 98% of spending and revenue in these two budgets are the same. And I think that even compared to other years, you certainly see notable differences in places like maybe transportation funding. There's some differences on local aid, nursing home rates. There are things that we can talk about. But I think the general tact on the House and Senate from a spending standpoint is relatively the same. They both came in about a percentage point lower in spending than the governor, but that's still about a 6% year over year spending growth clip, which is a pretty strong rate of spending growth. And on the revenue side, not a whole lot of policy differences on revenue. The big revenue decision before the House and the Senate was what to do with a number of tax proposals included in the governor's budget, and the House and the Senate are on the same page on that. None of those proposals made it into their budget, so there's not a lot of differences there. What I think is unique about this conference committee is obviously the world around us has changed a lot since January, when a lot of the initial assumptions are developed that then are used in the budget. We see a lot more economic uncertainty, certainly a lot of federal actions. And so I think the big task for House and Senate is to take a step back, reassess some of those underlying revenue assumptions, make sure they're managing that spending growth with that heightened uncertainty in mind.
So let's start out with that tax question, because as we are recording, it is another week in Massachusetts, which means that it is another week for people to be talking about what is the deal with the fair share or millionaire's tax surcharge. So again, this is a surcharge on incomes over $1 million that is specifically dedicated for the big buckets of transportation and education funding. And so in the years since we have actually seen revenue come in from that, the ratios have shifted somewhat in how the budgets have dealt with them year over year. So right now, how are the House and Senate approaching where this pot of money is going?
Sure. So maybe just a little background on the millionaire's tax, the income surtax, we often call it. So basically, the standard income tax rate in Massachusetts is 5%. Through a ballot initiative, a surtax has been applied to income over $1 million. It's a little higher than that now because it gets adjusted for inflation, but an additional 4%, right? So income over $1 million basically is taxed at 9%, under $1 million taxed at 5%. And by the language of the ballot question, those resources can only be used for education and transportation. And so when that tax went into effect, which happened in 2023, one of the challenges before policymakers was how to use this in the budget, how to kind of comply with the language in the question. And so what they have done is they have allowed themselves to spend up to a certain level in the operating budget each year. And then any surtax collections over that get divided into two other funds. One is kind of a rainy day fund for the surtax, and then one is intended to be used for one-time spending, infrastructure, kind of non-operating budget type costs. And so this is the first year where there actually has been additional funds to spend in the form of one-time, infrastructure and things like that. And so we've seen bills work their way through the legislature in parallel with the operating budget this year. And actually that bill is in conference committee right now, in addition to the operating budget.
Yeah, and kind of to that point, one question that has come up a lot that's been very interesting to me is debate over essentially what the fair share money is supposed to be doing. The idea of, is it supposed to be going in and essentially being additional funding that's going for these areas, or is it supposed to be saying, well, funding the T is very, very expensive. And if we're able to fill in some gaps with the fair share funding, does that now free up other money to go somewhere else? And so that's been a very interesting, odd debate to follow. What's your read on where this money is supposed to be going and how it's supposed to be relating with to all of the other revenue sources we've got coming in?
That's been, I think, one of the larger overarching challenges. And I think the first part of that challenge was how to use the budget processes to hopefully demonstrate to folks where these resources are being used. And I think the administration, the House and Senate deserve some credit. I think it's a pretty transparent process right now where there's there's a new section of the budget, Section 2F. I'm sure everyone's very familiar with that, which is now all the surtax resources, right? So if you want to see how it's being spent in the budget, that's where you would look. And then you have this supplemental budget. And so both the House and the Senate have $1.3 billion spending proposals out there to use these one-time funds on a variety of things. And so when you combine those two things together, a couple things jump out. So the Governor Healy back in January put forward a major transportation finance proposal that really was wedded to both the operating budget and this, we'll call it a surtax supplemental budget. It's a mouthful, but I'll try to stick with that. And combining those two things, they got to 50-50 between education and transportation. This is something that's been discussed for a while. What's the breakdown? It is skewed more heavily towards education over the first couple of years of the tax. Governor's proposal, when you combine those two bills, 50-50, and then made some major new investments in a variety of areas across transportation. The House largely aligns with the governor's proposal, so they also get to 50-50. The Senate doesn't quite get to 50-50. They remain more heavily weighted on the education side. And so one of the other wrinkles we see in the budget negotiation is we've got this parallel negotiation going on at the same time with this supplemental bill. And really, there's a lot of interplay between the two. And so we could see those things resolved kind of in tandem. And I think that'll give us a good sense of where we land in relation to this idea of this even division, which is something MTF has called for between education and transportation, but also more importantly, kind of how the resources are being used.
And getting into, you mentioned, of course, say, 90 something percent of the Senate and House budgets look pretty similar right now at the kind of scale that we're looking at. Even those little kind of nitpicky differences can tell you something pretty serious about the positionings of these two chambers. I'm also glad you brought up that, the Senate tends to be more education focused often in these discussions about transportation and education spending. So what were the major differences that you saw in these two budgets, kind of just topic areas, and then we'll kind of break down each one?
Sure. So on the spending front, again, there is a lot in common. The differences. So the governor and the Senate budgets go about $30 million higher on unrestricted local aid to cities and towns. The House provides additional resources in the form of Medicaid rates to nursing homes. Those would be kind of major differences. And then there are things, what's complicated this year is there are things that because one branch may deal with it more in the operating budget and another branch may deal with it more in the supplemental budget where it might look like a big difference and it's a little harder to tell what the actual differences are. So early education would be an example of that, where the Senate's number in the operating budget are higher, but the House is higher in this supplemental budget. And so we're going to have to kind of see how those things get negotiated out. And then you have a lot of different kind of smaller local priorities in the House and Senate that tend to not be a subject of a lot of kind of ongoing debate or discussion. But aside from that, I really will say, when you think about broad-based approach to Medicaid, which is the biggest part of the budget, broad-based approach to K-12 education finance reform, so Student Opportunity Act implementation, you really see much more in common than you do different on the spending side.
Well, sounds like it's the big one. So let's start with Medicaid. How are the two chambers approaching this?
On Medicaid, I think the big question has been and continues to be, what is the federal government going to do to change Medicaid policy, and when do those changes go into effect? We haven't yet seen in the governor's budget, the House or the Senate budget, any real adjustments to the state's Medicaid program, which is called Mass Health, because we just don't know what the feds are going to do. And I think this gets to a broader question that we've talked a great deal about at MTF in terms of, we know there's a lot of federal policy uncertainty, and we know that folks want to be proactive and want to make sure we're adapting to a new world. At the same time, you don't want to react prematurely before you have as much information as you can have. And I think that the fact that the governor's budget, the House and Senate, have taken more of a kind of steady course on Medicaid, with exceptions related to things like nursing home rates and things like that, makes sense. But we need to be very mindful of some of the proposals that we continue to see work themselves now before the U.S. Senate. What I will say is, overarching Medicaid cost growth has been growing at a very strong clip in recent years. And that's a big budget challenge, right? It's the biggest part of the budget. And so when it grows faster than the rest of the budget, is cross subsidized by lack of spending growth in other areas. And so one thing we do see in this year's budget are proposals to try to think through how we can limit costs in certain specific areas of Medicaid going forward. And I think initiatives like that are critical, because you can't turn the Medicaid ship on a dime, right? This is a $20 billion program, but we know we need to manage those costs in the context of a healthcare system that's under strain. Those are really challenging policy questions, even before you get into whatever the feds are going to do.
And how is this intersected with the work that's been coming out through the legislature on healthcare reform more broadly? We just got out of a last budget cycle where, pretty late into the fall, they did ultimately end up passing a big package around healthcare reform. But as you mentioned, and I think as we'll mention a few times, the world feels very different in terms of where Massachusetts is situated with relationship to the federal government, what resources it can expect and support it can expect from the federal government on healthcare, on transportation, on energy, a whole lot of things. So is the Medicaid discussion bound up in all of these other questions about how Massachusetts' healthcare system is able to chug along, or is it able to be siloed out as kind of a single threatened issue?
So I think there's a couple storylines on the healthcare front in Massachusetts. One is a kind of post-COVID system continuing to be under strain in this really challenging dynamic where I think providers are financially strapped, and at the same time, healthcare costs are growing at an unsustainable rate. That's not a good combination, right? Because we know that we've got a lot of providers, community health centers, hospital systems that are under strain, and at the same time, premiums are going up at a rate that's not affordable for people. And I think we've heard policymakers talk about that, the Healy administration talk about that. We don't see anything macro in this budget to kind of address that issue. That would likely take a more legislative approach through a different bill, but you see implications of that. So, for example, you see a proposal in the House to use resources from a trust fund that's a healthcare trust fund to replenish what's called the health safety net in Massachusetts. The health safety net is how we pay claims for healthcare for folks who are uninsured or don't have sufficient insurance. There's been a bigger and bigger shortfall in that system over time. And so you see a proposal in the House that is going to be one of the bigger, I think, policy discussions during conference committee. The other thing, as I mentioned before, you see are some proposals to try to manage Medicaid cost growth over time, specifically related to personal care attendant programs or ways that we provide services that are critical services for people who need Medicaid. They're also really expensive, and they've been growing at a really strong rate. And so trying to manage those. So you see kind of ways to nibble around some of the edges, but this is not kind of the vehicle I think folks are looking at for that kind of larger scale system reform, cost containment. But that may come at us sooner rather than later, because we're also going to have to react to what the federal government does.
Speaking of system costs, education. How have they been approaching, and how has MTF kind of been advocating for the amount of fair share going to educational costs and kind of where it's best placed, essentially? Because I think it ties into what we were talking about earlier, which is this freeing up money for other things, or is it starting new initiatives? Is it filling in major holes? So education spending, where are they in agreement? Where are they clashing?
So when you talk about education, the budget, there's really three sectors, right? So we think of early education, we think of K-12, and we think of higher ed. So let me take them kind of piece by piece. So on early education, one of the most major policy initiatives that the state has undertaken and maintained over the last 5 years is the creation of a new child care stabilization grant program for child care providers, which is a $475 million program, right? A major new spending program that kind of came out of the pandemic. So that's where a lot of the focus over the last couple of years has been, is trying to make sure we can maintain that in the budget. That's in the FY26 budget, both House and Senate. Where there now continues to be more focus, and something that our team does a lot of work on, is how we support the child care financial assistance system. So this is folks who are eligible for subsidized child care, low-income families, families involved in the child welfare system. That's a system that has seen growth in recent years, but it's a system under a lot of challenges, especially when we relate to certainly access, but also the workforce in the child care system and their ability to kind of maintain and retain folks with historically low wages. So that tends to be the area where you see the most policy discussion right now. K-12, really the major issue has been implementation of the Student Opportunity Act. So this was a major reform to the state's education finance formula that was signed into law in 2019. We're getting actually close. This is the second to last year of implementation for that. That has been a big success in terms of increasing the amount that the state devotes to especially low-income students and districts that educate a large share of low-income students. But we also have seen a lot of real local finance challenges related to how we pay for the local share of K-12 education. And in the Senate budget, we see a commission or an advisory group created to look at some of those fiscal challenges we're really seeing at the local level related to how we pay for K-12. So that's the big focus there. And then on the higher education front, we've seen a lot of policy movement in higher education in recent years, right? First, the Mass Reconnect program is proposed by Governor Healy, and then that was expanded last year in an initiative led by the Senate to come up with universal free community college. So kind of maintaining that, I think, is a big element of this year's budget, and we see that in both the House and the Senate. I think, once again, the big open question there is, if the federal government makes major changes in relation to Pell Grants, other areas of financial aid, does that shift significant more cost on the state to maintain a program like that? And what does that look like?
Okay, and I think what we need to do is our little crystal ball look ahead at this point. We kind of joked around it, but the idea that there is a deadline by which we need to have a state budget is sort of a punchline at this point in Massachusetts. We don't tend to have a budget in on time. So in case you don't excitedly follow the budget calendar, when are we supposed to have this done? What is the way that you would presume that this would unfold, and then what do you actually expect?
Sure. So the fiscal year starts on July 1st, right? So theoretically, you would expect to have a new budget signed into law by July 1st. Historically speaking, if we look back over the last 15 years, the budget tends to get done in July, right? So what happens when you don't have a budget in place in July 1st? The state does have a pretty sound system in place to make sure there's a continued maintenance of government services. So they do something that's pretty pro forma, which is called a 1/12th budget, or an interim budget, which says until the final budget is signed into law, every program can continue as it was in the prior fiscal year. And so that has become a relatively standard practice. I think in terms of when the budget needs to be done, there's no other particular magic to July 1st. But one thing that is important is demonstrating that we have our fiscal house in order, right? And so whether it's to bond rating agencies, whether it's to taxpayers in Massachusetts, you want to make sure folks feel like the finances of the Commonwealth are in sound hands. And so that's why I think really getting a budget done, if it's not done for July 1st, in that early July timeframe, I think can be helpful in demonstrating that. I will say this year is interesting because we do have so much federal uncertainty. And so there's going to be a lot of this budget that's probably written in a bit of pencil, because depending on what the feds do related to their spending bills, that's going to have some direct implications on the budget. And depending on what happens to the broader economy, that's going to have implications as well. And so those are some of the factors that relate to kind of the timeline of the budget. And just so folks know, at the state budget level, when the budget goes to Governor Healy, she has what's called a line item veto, right? So she doesn't just have the option of signing or rejecting the entire bill. She can sign the bill and veto certain spending items, reduce spending. She can actually propose changes to sections. So the process is a little more involved. And And I would expect in a year with so much uncertainty that we would see more focus on what the governor does with her veto powers this year to make sure she feels like she's got a budget in place for the new fiscal year that puts the state on a sound financial footing to deal with all this uncertainty.
I think that's a great note to sort of conclude on because, of course, often during the budget cycle, the conflict is between the chambers and either each other or the governor, where you'll often see this dynamic where because the budget is often done kind of on the later side or legislation is passed on the later side, it gives the governor more of an opportunity to kind of really make a mark and make her stamp, but there are often disputes at the end of the budget cycle if there was a particular program that both chambers felt very strongly about and the governor tries to mark down, they will sometimes try to override that. That's true of the budget as well, right?
It is, but it also, I think, gets me to a kind of a broader point, which is especially in this time of heightened uncertainty, we need to make sure there is good coordination between the House, the Senate, and the administration, that the House and the Senate provide to the governor a spending bill that is mindful of the fact that the revenue picture and the economic outlook looks different than it looked in January. And we need to make sure that as we're going through the veto exercise process, that everyone's on the same page in terms of what that fiscal outlook looks like and how we're going to make adjustments to ensure that a budget that even before we saw economic uncertainty had a structural deficit, that we're doing things to manage that in fiscal year 26 so that we're not making really tough decisions where the options are only different shades of bad. And so I think that speaks to this kind of getting a budget to the governor that takes account of economic uncertainty and a coordinated process that relates the budget to the larger federal uncertainty in our response to what the feds are doing.
Thanks again to Doug Howgate of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, or MTF, for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Charlie Cazella. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other people find us. And email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. We'll be back next week.